Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Colin Rowan with Pecan Street, and if you are here for the Building Decarbonization webinar, you're in the right place. We are right at noon Central Time, and I see that there are people who are going to be joining us for the next 30 seconds or so. So we're going to pause for just about a minute, and then we will be right back to you and we'll start the webinar. Thank you. All right, in the interest of time, I think we're going to get going. I think there are still a few people that are joining, but I want to make sure that we use the hour wisely. So again, thank you guys for joining us today. My name is Colin Rowan. I'm the Director of Communication for Pecan Street. I'm going to be your moderator today. Our panelists today are experts on different parts of building decarbonization, an issue that I think is a lot more important and complicated than most people may realize. I'm going to introduce our guests in just a minute, but I have a couple of small housekeeping items and then a quick introduction into the issue. First, some quick housekeeping. Please check our website frequently for information about upcoming webinars, to view videos of past events. You can email us, and Clayton, can you move to the next slide? I skipped one. You can email us at media@pecanstreet.org if you got this invitation from anyone other than us. If you got it from us, we've got your name already. We'll add you to future lists. And of course, you can learn more about our work at pecanstreet.org. Finally, the link at the bottom, the Electric Texas link, will take you to a report that we issued a while ago that touches on one part of decarbonization. It's the electrification of residential heating. We did an analysis on that with one of our panelists today. I attended a webinar last week where people could unmute themselves, and let's just say it didn't go well. So until we figure out how to do this in a less impersonal way, all attendees are muted. So to ask your questions or make comments, please use the chat button on your screen. We're going to be monitoring that all through the webinar. Clayton is going to be monitoring that, and each of our guests, our panelists, are going to be monitoring that. So please feel free to ask questions at any time, and we're going to do our best to get through them as quickly as possible. All right, so let's get started. When most people think about reducing climate emissions or about air quality issues that result from fossil fuels, they think of a fairly standard list of topics. Electricity, whether it comes from emission-free sources or fossil fuels; transportation, from planes, trains, and automobiles to the equipment that moves our cargo and powers our economies; ships, trucks, buses, port equipment, and construction equipment. Agriculture is another big category, whether it's emissions from cattle or other food animals, to the potential of capturing carbon through new agricultural practices. But there's a big piece of the greenhouse gas pie that's talked about much less, not by our guests, but in general. The emissions generated from the construction and the use of our buildings: houses, apartments, condos, schools, office buildings, shopping centers, just about everything with four walls and a roof. Depending on the part of country you live in or the choices made by the people who designed and built your home, school, or workplace, fossil fuel combustion may provide space heating, water heating, and cooking, both stovetops and ovens. In total, 40% of global greenhouse gas emissions come from the built environment. And it's important to remember that on-site fuel also causes good old-fashioned air pollution, not just climate pollution. Houses with gas stoves, for example, have higher incidence of asthma, and emissions from buildings continue to increase. And I want to thank Amar and RMI because I stole all of these numbers directly from your website. For a combination of climate and health reasons, many cities and countries are moving toward reducing these on-site fossil fuels through both incentives that encourage alternatives or policies that reduce or prohibit them. Berkeley, California was among the first cities in the states to require all new buildings to be electric only, and several other cities in California and elsewhere have passed or are considering similar policies. And as you might imagine, the fossil fuel industry is paying attention and is pushing back. Here in Texas, the governor just this week signed a bill that prohibits cities from specifically prohibiting any utility fuel. It doesn't mention natural gas, but it is absolutely about natural gas. Aside from the politics, there are real technical and logistical challenges to decarbonizing our buildings. How long will it take? How expensive will it be? Who will pay for it? And a question that everyone in Texas might be asking, given our energy crisis in February, can the grid handle millions of new electric hot water heaters, heat pumps, and electric hook surfaces? Joining us today to address these issues are Amar Shah of Rocky Mountain Institute, where he leads strategic research and analysis for the Carbon-Free Buildings Program. Joshua Rhodes, a research associate at the University of Texas at Austin, a founding partner of Idea Smiths LLC, and a frequent Pecan Street contributor. Collaborator, contributor, same thing. Tom Payne, a senior policy advisor at Consul. Tom has worked in the building efficiency, energy policy, and sustainability sectors for over 10 years. And also from Consul, William Allen, the senior technical advisor there. Dr. Allen is responsible for the management, planning, and technical oversight of Consul's energy efficiency projects. So thank all of you for joining us, and we'll get started. I think it might be helpful to start with a broad synopsis of building decarbonization. Amar, I wonder if you can start by adding to or correcting anything that I said in my introduction, and share some of the reasons why groups like RMI and others, and there are a lot of groups that are working on this, why you're focused on decarbonization as such an important issue for us to be thinking about. Amar?
Sure, and thank you, Colin, and the broader, I guess, Pecan Street family for having me here and having RMI here. So totally on the same page as some of the sectors that you had mentioned and some of the key notes. As we think about it, the building sector and its contribution to emissions falls into three major buckets. One is the electricity we consume in buildings, right? So we have the opportunity through energy efficiency, through grid interactivity, et cetera, to change the way we consume that electricity. But there's also an adjacency to the electricity sector where clean electricity and clean electricity is sort of naturally reducing emissions from the building sector. A second big bucket is direct combustion. So even if we could sort of snap our fingers and have 100% clean electricity every minute of every hour of every day of the year, we would still be burning natural gas, fuel oil, et cetera, in a number of homes, 70 million plus homes, businesses, institutional buildings across the country. And so that's sort of just in the US. So there's an exercise there around kind of thinking about how to transition towards cleaner alternatives. And then the last big bucket that we think about is embodied carbon. So the emissions that go into construction materials, given that the real estate and construction sectors are very much tied into this. So those are sort of the broad buckets, and in different parts of the world, you have different challenges, different also parts of the country. In the US, direct combustion is one that we think a lot about. There have been huge strides in the electricity sector. Texas, for sure, is a leader in many cases on wind and solar deployment. Direct combustion, so the kind of emissions from the burning of fossil fuels in our buildings has been a really stubborn statistic, as you highlighted. We have seen more efficient appliances over time and more efficient new construction. At the same time, we're building new buildings every day, right? And so the growth has pretty much canceled out pretty much canceled out many of those efficiency gains in looking at that particularly stubborn metric. And so as we look ahead to how do we get over the next 20, 30 years to a safe climate aligned future, there's a number of paths that folks have surfaced. One of which is essentially to transition a number of these technologies, these homes and buildings, to technologies that already exist, right? So to these electric technologies, and then to leverage the gains and improvements in the electricity sector to really use that to sort of progress the decarbonization of the building sector. There are other pathways that have been highlighted around sort of low carbon gas, but one of the big questions that people have highlighted is there are just many, many underlying questions about how much it would cost, how much there is, whether the technology is really there to sort of decarbonize all the gas that we consume today. So we think a lot about that specific bucket of, the fossil fuel we're burning in buildings, and what would a low cost, pragmatic, safe pathway look like to get Texas and to get the U.S. to a place where we're decarbonized more broadly. And so from a planning perspective, a couple of things that we observed right off the bat are, one, we're sort of going in the wrong direction. The president of the American Gas Association likes to say, in the U.S. we're adding a new gas customer every minute. And so there are hundreds of thousands of new gas customers and infrastructure that goes into that in many cases is built and designed and amortized to last, 50, 60, 80 years. And when we buy a new piece of equipment in a home, in many cases, we don't plan on revisiting that decision for another 10, 15, 20 years. And so thinking now about the decisions we need to make, as well as about some of the additional costs that introduces. In the US, we have an aging gas infrastructure. We've been sort of replacing our gas pipelines at a pace that hasn't really kept up with the pace at which we're building it out. So we have a huge number of distribution gas mains that are over 50, 60, 70 years old. And the spending in the US to maintain those has tripled just over the last 5 to 7 years. So we're now up to $22 billion, which is a significant increase. And so as we look ahead at how do we reduce potential health costs, how do we manage our infrastructure investments, and then how do we make sure that the pieces are coming together for kind of an equitable plan to decarbonize the building sector, we really think that electrification and sort of planning it out, starting with the low-hanging fruit. So what are the opportunities that are economic today, that really make sense for the market today? And then moving to the proven technologies, but that perhaps may not be cost effective in terms of upfront cost today, figuring out how to make those work in the marketplace more broadly. So that was kind of a mouthful, but that's how we think about it today.
No, good. That's very, very helpful. And I'll kind of move on to some policy questions specifically for Tom in a minute. But if you, I'll put you on the spot here for a minute. When you talk about the tried and true, the low hanging fruit for people who are listening, what are the things that maybe from a consumer side of things are those low hanging fruit? I think they might be obvious to you guys. You guys are experts on it, but if people who are tuning in and they're trying to figure out the quickest way for them to make a direct impact, what options do they have?
Yeah, so I'll say, just as an example, in the residential space, newer buildings, we found that there are savings from all electric new construction related to saving on not having to buy two appliances, your sort of gas furnace and your air conditioner, but being able to buy sort of an air source heat pump, as an example, that is basically an AC that kind of works in two directions. It also provides additional efficiency when we talk about cooling. And so you can get bill savings in a climate that's really cooling dominant. So heating and cooling, newer buildings in particular, as well as folks that are using sort of delivered fuels, so like oil and propane. Those are expensive. In Texas, there's also a large number of electric resistance heating, where deploying these higher efficiency technologies can actually just yield bill savings. There's flat out saving. So those are a couple of the examples that, in particular, kind of making sure our new construction is efficient, all electric, and looking for some of those retrofit opportunities that yield bill savings that can actually cover perhaps a slightly higher upfront cost for a heat pump. Right?
Got it. Awesome. Great. I want to jump to policy for a minute, which I think is a good introduction for Tom. So, Tom, can you give us a kind of a state of the union on building decarbonization policy, kind of where this movement is, like at what stage are we, and what some of the big policy opportunities and challenges and implications there are?
Right. So we got two ways of looking at it, right? I mean, we've got a country, right? We have these United States and a federal government that has a set of policy, which, for the last 4 years, we haven't actually had any energy policy to speak of. There hasn't been any environmental policy. There's just been dismantling. We've seen some good signals from the Biden administration so far in terms of supporting new equipment efficiency standards, as well as putting some real money behind energy efficiency, especially in low-income housing. And it is important when you target at low-income housing because that tends to be older housing. It tends to have less efficient equipment, and there tend to be some really kind of low-hanging fruit gains you can get by targeting those folks, and it has that kind of broader kind of economic benefit. The problem with relying on the federal government for policy, though, is the federal government is really susceptible to a lot of targeted interest groups, fossil fuel industry in particular. So I don't think we're likely to see true electrification or true decarbonization policy from the federal government apart from the things that are agreeable. And those are those things like energy efficiency, equipment standards, etc. You'll see some spending targeted, but I don't think there's an appetite even now to actually cut into the bottom line of a lot of the fossil fuel companies. And so one of the things that happens there, I think we may see a bigger push to low carbon fuel stocks for combustion fuels, renewable fuel stocks. But the amount and the availability of those things is extremely limited, highly variable, and really uncertain. So the future may tell how viable that is, but it's going to come slowly as we rely on the federal government to kind of push those things forward. In the alternate, we also functionally have 50 different countries setting different policy with regards to electrification, decarbonization. And you have places like California, where I'm at, and we've got state policy right now is pushing electrification very hard. We are going to see electrification of all new construction within this decade pretty clearly. We're already seeing calls for at least one type of heat pump in all new construction, whether that's a water heater or space conditioning, and requirements for pre-wiring for all electric end uses in new construction. That's already happening. So California at least has set up a pathway where we're going to get, our buildings electrified, and then we have a pathway to a clean electric grid for 2045, and you get both those things done, and now you've got a decarbonized building sector. But you have a lot of other states. You have a lot of states that either don't care about the issue, rely heavily on fossil fuel production. You think places like Pennsylvania and Texas and others who, half of their economy is relying on fossil fuels, and they're not going to dig into that unless there's some other external incentive that pushes that. So I think what we end up happening is we get a couple of, leaders out front, and California has a good opportunity to do this because California is one of the largest economies in the world. So if California can prove that it's effective, cost effective, and practical, then others will follow the example because it's just going to be easy to do and it'll be a natural thing to do. And then you have your fossil fuel producers who are going to hold on for a long time. But then you have the other problem of folks in cold climates. And this is a more challenging issue because folks in cold climates, for one, heat pumps don't work quite as well in cold climates. They do work, but you lose some efficiency there. But folks in cold climates also very commonly rely on backup or backup heating sources, whether that's a fireplace or a standalone stove of one kind or another. It's always combustion they rely on these things for. And, often it's gas or propane, but it's also very commonly wood, which has, huge particulate emissions and all these other concerns. So we have kind of this huge range of issues to deal with when it comes to policy and building electrification. We see some places where it's really easy, and those places are actually mostly in the South. We see a huge strip of states across the South, Mississippi, Alabama, Louisiana, where heat pumps are common and have been common for a long time. They're not using furnaces, they're not using combustion for primary fuel sources. They've been using electricity for decades because they don't have high heating demand, and they have relatively cheap electricity. So the economy drives that choice, and it's done a pretty good job of keeping them in that low carbon portion of the building or the built environment in terms of where emissions are coming from. So, and then you have your middle difficulty places like California. And California is that middle difficulty because California has a huge variety of climates, right? We have mountainous regions and huge amounts of snow, and we have the hottest deserts in the world, and we have coastal climates. And so, there's this range. And so when you want to build statewide policy to decarbonize, you have to have all of these things kind of taken into account. And then you have our cold climates, your Minnesotas and Wisconsins and such, that are going to be their own challenges. So that's kind of where everybody's at in a nutshell. I mean, and then there's that broader kind of question of how every state is prioritizing climate change generally. So there are a lot of big challenges that vary widely across the country. I think if we see, Democratic leadership in the federal government for a few years longer, we can see some more federal spending there helping bring that down. But there is no long-term plan from the federal government, and it's a hard thing to rely on when there doesn't seem to be a lot of appetite for doing that. So I think the best opportunity for decarbonization from a policy perspective is setting the practical example and helping drive down costs where it's most practical, where it's most available for equipment and for end uses for consumers, because it's going to be that consumer choice is going to be the thing that makes the day in places where you don't have functional policy on the topic. So you have a couple of leadership states that can set the policy, and then hopefully what we'll see is a good example that's pretty easy to follow, that's helped driven down costs, and we'll see other states kind of catch on to that and do it because it's easy, because it's cheaper, and because now it makes sense to do. That's hopeful. But we've seen it happen with solar. Solar has grown immensely in the last decade plus. And I think we can see that happening with heat pumps. Heat pump water heaters are great. They're not hugely prevalent. I think we're seeing 1 or 2% nationwide right now, but they're extremely efficient and they're cheap. They're cheap compared to resistance, and they come in right around similar costs on utilities as tankless gas water heaters, but it's good equipment. The technology has gotten a lot better, and getting people to change their minds about that and bring that stuff in, and the more it's adopted, the more we can help drive down costs and work those things forward.
Got it. Thank you. Very helpful. I do want to jump to on kind of some of the technical challenges. I do a lot of work on vehicle electrification, and electrifying transportation isn't as simple as deciding I want to buy a new car and then plug in my charger. There's a lot of infrastructure needs that happen when you electrify a sector like transportation, and I suspect there are some complicated technical issues to think about on the degasifying homes as well. And so, Will, I wonder if you can kind of maybe give us a little primer on some of the technical challenges that are kind of embedded in this transition.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, the short answer really is that the technical challenges have mostly been solved. It's really now a question of scaling them up to a national level, where there are going to be a number of issues. One of which, for example, as we talk about, for example, a heat pump water heater replacing a gas water heater. So what are the issues around that? To take the example of California, at the moment in new construction, only about 2% of newly constructed homes are using heat pump water heaters rather than natural gas. Now, we want to switch that from 2% to 100%. There are going to be supply chain issues. So those need to be resolved by, a combination of builders making sure that they are getting their orders in early enough, manufacturers ramping up their supply lines, distribution chains, and so on. So even though, the technical challenge of the water heater itself has been solved and they are nice and they are reliable, getting them into homes is going to be a bigger challenge. And that's only when we're talking about new construction. Once you start thinking about the other 99% of existing homes where we're trying to retrofit them, if we want to do that on a scale of, a decade or 2 decades, then you're talking millions of homes every year, and it becomes an incrementally larger problem. But again, that is a manufacturing issue rather than a technical issue per se. There is also a customer acceptance issue, because builders, just to stay with water heaters, builders spent a long time switching from tanked water heaters to tankless water heaters. And one of the initial problems with that was persuading people that these were going to work just as well. And the selling point that was used primarily there was, well, your tankless heater gives you an unlimited supply of hot water. It's never going to run out. And now we're going to say to them, oh, well, actually, what we want to do is go back from your unlimited gas instantaneous water heater to a tanked system because it's going to be better. And that's kind of a hard sell. Interestingly, it seems to be more of a concern for builders than it actually is for consumers. People complain less about running out of water when they have hot, retrofitted or new construction heat pump water heaters than the builders anticipate when they're planning things. All it needs really is to ensure that the sizing of the water heater is done correctly. They'll typically be slightly larger. If you compare a gas tank water heater with a heat pump water heater, you'll probably need to go one size up from say a 50 gallon to a 66 gallon with the heat pump water heater to ensure that you get the same, first hour delivery. So this is an education question. And the same also applies to the other main systems in the house that we're going to try and electrify. As Amar mentioned earlier, that replacing a furnace and air conditioning system with a heat pump air conditioning system, there's not a huge difference in cost. But there are differences in the way they work, mostly on the heating side. Obviously, the air conditioning side is the same. The cooling won't change. But when it comes to heating, the delivery temperature of the air from a furnace, is 140 odd degrees. You feel this blast of hot air coming out of your registers, and that's very comforting. With a heat pump system, you have a much lower air delivery temperature. So people need to be educated that, when you turn it on, you're not going to feel that same sort of instantaneous heat coming off it. But again, that's a question of education, and it's a question of sizing. And this is where things like smart thermostats are really going to come into their own. That yes, if you leave your house cold while you're out all day, you have less of an ability to walk through the door into a cold house, turn your thermostat up, and get instantaneous heat. So your smart thermostat learns your behavior, you program it better, you have better setback times. So it's education both for the builders putting them in and the consumers using them. Neither your heat pump water heater nor air conditioning really have any kind of emotional issues. What does have an emotional tie-in with customers is their gas range cooktop. This is something that, if you survey people about what they're going to object to if they try and move them into an all-electric building, the one thing people say is, I love to cook, I'm not giving up my gas range. There's a problem here is that mostly when people think of electric cooktops, we all think back to the sort of, the electric ring with the coil that gets hot and it always smokes and you can never keep them clean and they're always slightly tilted so your pans don't sit on them properly. That's a very, antiquated view. What we're talking about when we talk about electrification is either a high-end resistance cooktop, which tends to be flat and a glass-like surface with hidden elements, or increasingly induction cooktops. which really are the future. They, from every perspective, they are better than gas. They heat up more quickly, they are safer, you can't leave them accidentally turned on and burn yourself on them. You can't, they give off less heat that escapes the environment. They are better on indoor air quality. There have been studies shown that have looked at the impact of electric versus gas cooking, the temperature you cook things at, and whether or not you have your range hood turned on. And it's been shown that switching from gas to electric cooktops has more of an impact on your indoor air quality than whether or not your range hood is turned on when you're cooking. So there are a lot of great sales points here, and educating customers on that is much more of a challenge than the technology per se. So SMUD, the Sacramento municipal utility, did a study recently where they basically gave single, portable induction rings to a couple of hundred people, and then compared their before and after attitudes to induction cooking. And the number of people who said they were, would be enthusiastic about it went from 20-something% to 80-something%. So this is something that, can easily be done. Electrifying cooking can easily be done, provided we take the time and the trouble to educate customers. So, those are a number of the things that we're talking about when it comes to how we actually sell this to the public. The indoor air quality is one. Familiarity and why the change in equipment is not really going to be a difference is one of the other things. This is all mostly what applies to new construction. When it applies to retrofits, we're talking about a different set of challenges. Firstly, the cost is somewhat different because if you're looking at new construction, the difference between your electric and your gas appliance includes the cost of running wires for your electric appliance versus venting and piping for a gas appliance. If you're looking at a retrofit, swapping out the gas appliance, you already have the venting, you already have the piping. So that the incremental cost of switching becomes more. And then when you further look closer at, low income populations, you have an issue then of who is going to benefit from this, because you have a high proportion of renters in low-income communities. And how do you persuade the landlord to pay the extra few $100s up front, which saves the tenant money over the longer term, but doesn't necessarily benefit the landlord in the sort of short to medium term unless they're looking at the resale value of the property? So there are a lot of issues surrounding getting the technology into buildings that are less to do with the actual technical challenges and more to do with how you convince the market to accept that. When we start looking then at grid impacts of additional electric draw, that then becomes a whole other ballgame, and that then becomes about how you control the additional demand. And this is, I think, where we're looking at now, I hate to use the phrase the Internet of Things, but smart controls and smart technology to balance loads and to distribute resources is going to be critical. The main, if you're looking at switching out gas furnaces to electric heat pump heating, that's probably not going to have a significant impact on peak demand, because generally you'll be switching from, in somewhere like California or any sort of moderate or hot climate, you're going to be switching from a summer cooling peak to a winter heating peak. And by and large, that winter heating peak is going to be lower. So the existing infrastructure should be able to cope with that. In colder climates, as Tom mentioned with the cold weather heat pumps, the efficiency starts to go down slightly as the temperature gets lower. And so the draw from that is higher. There's also a higher upfront cost. And Mark could probably talk better than I can, because I know that the RMI have done the study, which showing that the best way to make heat pumps cost effective in colder climates is to improve the building shell first of all. which means that your lower efficiencies are less important because you're reducing your overall load. But again, that then falls back to the problem, well, that increases your upfront cost,
Right.
your first cost, versus your savings further down the road. And then again, you get this, like, well, if I'm a builder, how do I explain to my customer that they will pay a higher price initially, but they will save it down the road? And then that cascades down onto mortgages. How much can the person borrow? And if they have to pay more money for the house that they're saving on their utility bills, is that going to be reflected in the amount that the mortgage company will lend them? Because it doesn't necessarily change their debt to income ratios or their loan to income ratios that the mortgage company is willing to accept. So all of the technical issues, I think, in many ways are secondary to the market issues and how we can get this taken up by consumers and builders and lenders.
Good. Thank you. And I think that I have some questions and comments about that, the kind of moving the market. But there's something I want to pull Josh in now so we can talk specifically about grid impacts, because there's something that you mentioned specifically about some places shifting from a summer peak to a winter peak. Josh was the lead analyst and lead author of some work that Pecan Street did that looked at that for Texas, with kind of switching all of our residential heating to electric. And that's, of course, the conclusion that he reached, was that we would shift, which I think is kind of a crazy idea here in Texas, to think of us being a winter peaking state. And then, of course, with our catastrophe in February here in Texas, that conclusion can kind of be seen as a big problem, given how we had a winter storm and we couldn't handle the peak. So I do want to kind of transition a little bit so that Josh can kind of talk about some of the kind of the grid impacts of this shift. A lot of people are talking about the increased demand with the electrification of transportation, both on the passenger side and potentially on the corporate, the fleet side, and trucks and buses. This shift would add to that grid demand as well. And so, Josh, I don't know if there's a way for you to either tell us everything's going to be okay, or what the big things that we need to worry about are. But maybe you could talk about kind of, if, let's just say, Tom and Will and Amar succeed and we electrify. What does that mean for the electric systems and for customers and for individual states, and really just for kind of the electric system as a whole?
Yeah, so thanks. And maybe we can share the link to the paper that we did with the audience and with the group after this. So we did analysis a couple of years ago where we took all roughly 8 million homes within the ERCOT region, and if they did not have electric heat, we electrified their heat, and then we ran through multiple different years to see what the impact of that would be on total grid demand. So we looked at average years. We looked at what was then our our kind of winter year of record, 2011, and then 2018, which also had which at that point it had our highest winter peak at that time. And we did find that if we electrified heat, that we would move from a summer peak to a winter peak, and people in Texas do think that's crazy, but if we had been able to meet all of the demand that we had just a few months ago, we would have already been a winter peaking grid versus a summer peaking grid. I think we were scheduled to roughly get about 2,000 more megawatts or demand than we had previously had in a summer. So it's not outside the bounds to think that we could that we could get there, we could do that. And that has all kinds of implications for things like when power plants take maintenance outages and all kinds of stuff. But from that study, I mean, we did find that even looking at the industry efficiency minimum heat pumps that are out there, if that's what we swapped out into these, we would customers would save energy and we'd have less overall emissions. And while demand would go up, assumingly that would happen over time, right? So the grid would be able to see that, it would, be able to, evolve in order to get there. But I mean, roughly we were estimating about a 78 gigawatt, peak for a normal winter season. And so, if we were to take 2021 and run that weather through, I'm sure that we would see, quite a bit, higher of a winter peak. And so that may be the new weather year of record, going forward. And then, I mean, whether or not, we can say that, everything's going to be okay. I mean, that's a big question to, if there is policy, if there is anything that has us electrify, I think it'll be over time. It won't be like a switch that we were able to flip inside the model to be able to do that. So we will see that kind of, happen over time, and the grid should, result to that. And some of the things some other, other panelists have said, doing that, we saw significant savings in the summer. One of the reasons we become a winter peaking grid versus a summer peaking grid is because summer demand goes down because we had more efficient systems installed on the system. But overall, we did see, us transitioning to a winter peak.
So Josh, there's one of the in one of the interviews that I read about from you after the freeze, I think it was you, kind of hypothesized the wisdom of if the natural gas supply chain in Texas froze. And so it wasn't just that everyone's electricity went out, it was that the natural gas infrastructure was problematic. I don't want to pile on them, but it was problematic. And so the idea was floated that, one of the ways that we could reduce that problem and also potentially reduce on-site combustion is kind of reserve natural gas use for the power generators and not have homes across Texas when it freezes also be pulling from the same natural gas supply. It's a better supply chain argument, but it also achieves some of the stuff that, Amar was talking about, which is, not using gas to heat and for cooking in homes. And so that seems to be kind of an additional benefit.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think so. It makes it makes the winter interconnections between those two energy grids look more like the summer. Because I mean, obviously in Texas, in the summertime, nobody wants heat. Nobody wants, they don't even want a hot shower at that point in time. And so, it's so hot. And so, natural gas is free to flow to power plants, and then the electricity flows to home for, air conditioning. And so if we did electrify heat, then we would have, and homes and businesses were not competing for that natural gas in the wintertime, then it would be a more kind of linear flow of energy and easier to understand. I mean, I think one of the things about this, this winter is the electricity sector thought that the gas sector would be firm, and the gas sector thought they would get the electricity they needed to run their, compressors, and both were wrong. And so we ended up in these cascading, failures of infrastructure that got us, we're 12 million Texans without power for, multiple days. And so, but yeah, electrifying that in use, has the benefit of making that more linear, more easy to understand, more easy to plan for, less points of failure along the way. And then also, if we want to clean up the emissions associated, with that, it's easier to do that from a couple hundred locations than, a couple million locations, spread around. And when was the last time, there are people who exist, or their job is to make sure that a power plant is running efficiently, but when was the last time you got to check up for your air conditioner or heater? You probably don't until it breaks, right? And so it's like there's no one's job, because it's seen as a small thing, but for a power plant, it is a big thing.
Well, there's one question, and I don't want to sound, I'd like to think that when it comes to climate and emissions, I'm an optimist, and I'm certainly an early adopter on technology and renewable energy and things like that. But when I kind of add up the things that each of you guys have been talking about, which is the policy challenges before us, the market challenges, there seems to be a lot of inertia against this kind of change. And so, to Tom's point, if we're not going to get federal guidance on this and we're going to be relying on individual states, do we kind of have the critical mass of advocates, both policy advocates and environmental advocates and market advocates to get the kind of accomplishments in decarbonization as we need in the time frame that we need it, because we're not talking about accomplishing this over the next 300 years, right? We want to do this quickly. And so maybe I don't want to ask any one of you to be the spokesperson for this movement, but what are our odds? How do you guys feel about getting this done on the time frame from which we know we need to decarbonize?
It's going to be hard. And we're behind the curve right now, I think. And I think you could say that for the US, and I think, you can say that for a lot of Europe too, where they like to think they're further along than they are. I mean, especially after Germany offlined, and France did a lot of this too, of taking off a lot of their nuclear plants after Fukushima and all of that, a lot of ground was lost. I think our opportunity comes from our brighter examples. And again, I'll take California as this, and you can use other states like Massachusetts that have been really, really good at energy efficiency. And I saw a question earlier, someone commenting about how expensive electricity was in the chat compared to, I assume, natural gas for heating. California is some of the most expensive electricity in the country. And when we're running the numbers comparing the utility cost performance of a new home with either natural gas or electricity, we're finding about parity in most cases. There are a few cases where the all-electric home is a bit cheaper, and there are a few cases where the mixed fuel home is a bit cheaper. The mixed fuel home tends to be a bit cheaper in the colder climates. But we're very close to that place where the all-electric home is about the same cost to operate. And that's a really good sign, because that means we've got good equipment. And this is, again, in an economic utility structure that's not super favorable, because electricity in California is very expensive. But if California can make it economically viable to do, that means there's going to be better opportunities in other places. And when it becomes a natural economic choice, the thing is going to happen on its own. And I think that's where we have to look for the most opportunity.
Got it. Amar, it looks like you're getting ready to say something. You want to add on to that?
I was just going to add, in terms of the broad sweeping question, which I know is a doozy, are we going to get there? How are we feeling? I think the point that Will had mentioned earlier about scale, and about the need to really think about the kind of scale of the challenge of what needs to get done, and the kind of pace at which we need to start moving over the next decade to really set ourselves up in a cost-effective way, in a deliberate way. The two things that I think a lot about are, one, we need to sort of bring to life the benefits in addition to strictly, when we talk about sort of emissions reductions. So, Will mentioned that heat pumps perform more efficiently when you have envelope improvements. By the way, that keeps you warmer during a cold snap, right? When you look at the building stock in places that have historically been warm, and now the weather is getting more unpredictable, energy efficiency is a boring term to a lot of people. And we need to be talking about resilience, about days of safety, about reducing energy burden, and about health impacts. So I think that's one, is the ability to really bring to life the benefits, the suite of benefits that can come with taking ambitious action. And then the second thing I would note is that we are actually subsidizing a marketplace. Texas is a very different ecosystem, many different ecosystems within an ecosystem than Massachusetts, than California. But in virtually every part of the country, we are subsidizing infrastructure investments one way or the other. And we need to be very deliberate about those subsidies and investments and policies, so that they save people money, and so that they make people better off, and they fight the climate crisis. And so, to me, it's about making people aware, so that we can kind of direct our resources and move the market in the direction that will really kind of enable innovation. Right?
Yeah, I think just one there there's some comments in the chat about kind of the safety and efficacy of electrification, you know, particularly given the freeze here in Texas. And I think, Amar, your comment about, you know, having a safer, more efficient home so that when your power does go out, it doesn't drop to 8 degrees faster than someone with a newly built energy efficient home. I think all of these things kind of need to be considered as an important suite of things as opposed to just one or the other. You know, we're not talking about electrifying homes and then not improving their energy efficiency, because that home then becomes a less efficient and bigger draw on the grid. And so I think a lot of these, you know, here in the environmental community and in the renewable energy community, for years we've been talking about energy efficiency being the smartest, cheapest source of electricity on the planet, because there's nothing better than energy you don't have to use. And so I think that's something that needs to be kind of added on to all of this, the sales pitch, so to speak, is just kind of making us a kind of a smarter energy system that doesn't use more than we have to. So I would want to see if anyone had any additional comments here on kind of the steepness of the hill in front of us, and maybe what our attendees should be thinking about, what they might be able to do on a local level, local, state, or federal level to kind of play a role in this transition. Any thoughts from you guys on that?
I mean, my 2 cents is just that I think local action is kind of an individual action, but then like local action is really the node at which people can really, you know, as different places are taking accountability for their role in addressing emissions, addressing safety, addressing health.
Right.
I think that has been where we've seen success escalating, even in places you might consider, oh, well, you know, that's a totally different politics, totally different environment. All over the country, all over the world, it's the local action that I think is really kind of driving energy for making change. And so, yeah, I feel that's
Right.
my.
Yeah, and just actually to go back to what you were, Colin, saying, 'cause I'm also seeing a question in chat about this, about resiliency and insulation and air sealing and stuff. One of the things to really put in front of folks that I think gets lost in the noise sometimes is how beneficial, you know, that, you know, increasing the quality of your envelope is from an economic standpoint. I mean, you get your resilience, you get your home keeping its temperature longer, and you know, you can get some indoor air quality benefits and stuff like that. But you know, some basic air sealing, weather stripping, that kind of stuff, you can get simple payback conditions. 18 months, 2 years, you've got your money back. Adding insulation in your attic, similar conditions. I mean, you can get significant cost savings in a very short term window for not big money. I mean, maybe a couple $1,000s, but you can get a lot of that back really fast, and that drives down your emissions, that increases your resiliency, and it's definitely something you can do on your own. And there are a lot of places, and this isn't everywhere, and this is part of the haphazard nature of our federal system, but there are a lot of places that have some really great subsidies available to get some of that work done as well. And we may be seeing some more money from the federal government to get that coming too. So definitely, you know, if that isn't something you've investigated for your own personal home, go do it, you know, and see how much of a difference it makes. And then once you see how much of a difference it makes, tell your neighbors, because they're all able to get that same benefit, and it can be huge. It can be,
Right.
you're talking hundreds of dollars a year for some real simple work. I mean, we're not talking about expensive equipment, fancy machines. It's pretty simple stuff.
Right. There's so a couple of questions that came up on that are come up on the chat, and I want to make sure we address them. So, and I think y'all have responded to some of these in the chat, but there were some questions about renewable natural gas, and so maybe, you know, how much of an opportunity is this on the overall emissions front? Is the market big enough? Is there enough supply and infrastructure to actually rely on this? And so I don't know if any one of you has a particular thought or comment on that.
Well, I think we sort of started it, and just it's a big, economic question about how much it's going to cost and whether that cost is justified. There's another big like asterisk out here about hydrogen. If we get to a place where we can like, super overproduce electricity and then we can make hydrogen really cheap, then maybe that flips that equation. But I think for now, based on what we have, we're looking at, as Amar mentions, the difficult to electrify end uses, but that may shift.
And then there was another question here about embodied carbon. I'm not sure who the proper expert would be on this, but the specific question was, are there any standardized metrics to measure embodied carbon?
Embodied carbon is pretty hard to quantify when it comes to things like building materials, because if you take a simple case of a piece of lumber, you have to look at, well, where was it grown and where is it being put in and how much carbon was involved in that, in the manufacture and transportation. So there are metrics that can be used and can be quantified, but making an overall sort of a single number for an individual building component that would allow a straightforward calculation of, right, if I build a 2,000 square foot house using these techniques, this is the embodied carbon. There are some sort of large uncertainties in that, but I think it is something that is worth considering, because if, particularly when it comes to things like retrofits, if you take, for example, the example I looked at earlier of retrofitting an electric heat pump water heater versus a gas water heater, there's, if that's at the end of life, if that gas heater is broken, then I've got a choice of, gas versus electric, new one. But if I'm replacing something that works, we've got to look at, well, how much carbon am I adding to the equation by building something that I didn't need to be replaced.
Right.
Are the energy savings more than the added carbon? It's a similar thing to the old, the Cash for Clunkers program a while back. It's like, well, you're replacing an old car with a newer car, but if you're destroying something that works to replace it with something that you didn't need to build in the first place, that changes the equation. So short answer is there isn't really a short answer to that, I'm afraid.
Well, yeah. and I think that's an important distinction to make. It's important but complicated, and I think the idea of reducing combustion on site is important and less complicated in terms of quantifying the benefits, right? So, and I think that's why there's been, more of a focus on that. Is it's hard to figure out how to decarbonize the wood used in homes, but you can not burn fuel at your house much more simply.
And I think the comment about like end of life versus replacement is useful, and just remembering that sometimes the best gains we can make can be through boring things like building codes and efficiency standards, right? Like just make making the thing, if someone's going to replace something with the cheapest thing out there and they don't care about anything, like if you can make that cheapest thing they're going to replace it with better than what they had before, like at least there's that, right, as we move forward. And we can see things like some of the the very earliest work that I did with some Pecan Street data was looking at homes in Austin versus homes in the rest of Texas. And Austin has a higher efficiency minimum air conditioner rating than the rest of Texas. And unsurprisingly, homes in Austin used less energy. But it was just like, if you had to replace an air conditioner in Austin, you couldn't buy one here, or you couldn't install one that wasn't a higher efficiency like you maybe could get in Houston or something like that. So it just like those things also make a huge difference.
Right. Well, I want to. We're getting right on the hour, and so I guess I just wanted to ask any of the panelists if there were any parting thoughts that they would like to share. I think we'll try to follow up with attendees if there are any additional questions for any of the. I don't want to broadcast anyone's in particular email address, but anyone can send a question to media@pecanstreet.org. I'll be happy to connect you with, Amar or Josh or Will or Tom. And so please, if you've got additional questions or want to hear from any of these experts, please don't hesitate to reach out to me. I do want to thank all of our guests. Tom, Will, Amar, Josh, thank you for your time. Thanks for your expertise. And I guess more importantly than any of that, thanks for being an expert on this. I know it's a complicated issue, and the fact that we felt we needed to have 4 people on to talk about different aspects of it, I think is indicative of how all of the different things that we need to be thinking about in terms of moving this issue forward. So I want to thank all of you guys. Just as a quick closing note, here are the links and the contact information for our existing events, our past events, and future events at Pecan Street. You can always email us at media@pecanstreet.org. That's the best way to get in touch with us for future events, any other questions. And then we put it in the chat, but the report that Josh worked on with Pecan Street is there at the bottom, pecanstreet.org/electric-texas. I guess thank all of our panelists for being here, and thank everyone for attending. You guys have a great afternoon, and we'll see you on the next one of these. Thank you guys very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.